listening. Well, a warm welcome to you all, our webinar attendees and participants, as well as our panelists. Thank you for joining us today. We will begin in 5 minutes. Until then, you will notice we are in webinar mode on Zoom, so you will not have to worry about cameras or microphones being on accidentally. That said, we do want to hear from you. Please make the most of the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of the Zoom screen there, and send us your questions as they come to you. We look forward to being in conversation together today. We also have closed captions available for those of you following along. You can click on the captions button at the bottom of your screen. Whatever time it may be, wherever you are joining us from, you're welcome to take these next few minutes to stretch, to take a breather, grab a cup of tea or a refreshment, and we will begin in a few minutes. For now, here is a look at where you can download the formative situational analysis we'll be delving into today. And we are ready to start. Once more, warm talofa, mbula, kiorana, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Thank you for joining us today for the first in a series of webinars hosted by Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services. We're excited to bring together such a diverse group of thinkers, researchers, and change makers to launch and discuss reimagining Pacific research on gender equality. This webinar is the first in a quarterly series designed to spark meaningful conversations about research methodology, credibility, and the role donors play in either amplifying or limiting Pacific perspectives in research and knowledge documentation. As we mentioned earlier, we want to hear from you, and you are welcome to send your questions in via the Q&A function. And today, we're excited to share with you the Pacific Women Lead Formative Situational Analysis. I'm Mere Nailatikau, and today I have the privilege of being in conversation with the co-authors of this work, this labor of love, as you'll come to understand it. We have Virisila Buadromo, Ofa Guttenbeil-Likiliki, Nikki, Bartlett, and Niketa Kulkarni. Michelle was unable to join us due to unexpected events, but we send her our warmest, and we know she's with us in spirit. And the co-authors today will reflect on their insights, their co-authorship journey, and the importance of collaborating to decolonize Pacific gender research. This analysis is a snapshot in time, helping us understand the experiences of diverse Pacific women against the three outcome areas of Pacific Women Lead. They are women's leadership promoted, women's rights realized, and partners supported to strengthen Pacific ownership and effectiveness of regional gender equality efforts. This report will serve as an essential reference for Pacific Women Lead as it tracks change and shapes future efforts. We look forward to a rich and thoughtful conversation with you all. So thank you once again for being part of this important dialogue. I now invite Team Lead for Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services, Joanne Kunatumba, for a brief overview of this conversation.
Thank you, Mary. Just before I start, I can see that Ofa and Emily have their hands up. Let me just do a quick check.
Apologies, I was putting it down.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us today for the first in this series of webinars hosted by Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services. It's wonderful to see so many of you logged into our webinar today. My name is Joanne Kunatumba, and I'm the team leader for Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services. For those that don't know, Pacific Women Lead is DFAT's largest regional investment on gender equality. It is Pacific Women Lead is made up of 5 main components. SPC is the key implementing partner of the Pacific Women Lead portfolio and delivers the Pacific Women Lead at SPC program, which I'm sure many of you have heard of already. Other partners under the Pacific Women Lead portfolio are Women's Fund, so that's the Urgent Action Fund, the Fiji Women's Fund, and the Pacific Feminist Fund, and there's Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services, that's us. There's also DFAT's direct relationships with regional programs like UN Women and UNFPA. And finally, there's a Pacific Women Lead Governance Board, which SPC is the secretariat for. I recognize that a key enabler for this work has been having like-minded colleagues within our DFAT team who also value and encourage Pacific-led research. So I just want to give a shout out to our colleagues in Canberra. That is not always a given in donor-funded programs, as many of you know, and I acknowledge the openness and the support that has made this collaboration possible. Many large donor development programs are required to produce baseline data within the first 12 to 18 months of implementation. And this is a challenging task in a regional gender equality program where measuring change is both complex and nuanced. So the question for us is, how do we ensure research is more than just a tick in the box exercise? How do we move beyond the safe consultants who speak the language of donors to those with deep connections to communities and lived realities? This situational analysis was designed to be different. It is very much a collaboration, not just in its findings, but the process that we took, the methodology that we took to develop this report. For Pacific Women Lead, this situational analysis provides a snapshot in time, helping us understand the program's contributions across the outcome areas. For the co-authors, I hope it's more than just a report. It also amplifies diverse Pacific voices, and it also keeps our donor-funded programs accountable to the region. Because for us as a whole, research should not just inform policy, it should also strengthen the people and movements driving change. Vinaka Mere, and just a warm welcome again to everyone, and I look forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you, Joanne. As we mentioned earlier, we are missing Michelle today, but we send her our congrats remotely. And to our panelists, to Niketa, Nikki, Viri, and Ofa, congratulations on bringing such a foundational piece of work to completion. To set the scene for us today, one can only imagine what a journey it has been in your individual approaches to research in the Pacific. Not only that, but also its application in gender equality. And we often think of research as a vehicle for learning, but this has also been a process of reimagining what gender equality research looks like. As co-authors, was there anything that you needed to unlearn in the process of writing your respective contributions? Perhaps could Viri or Ofa, could you get started with your reflections?
Hi, Mere, Mbula, everyone. It's really hot here in Suva. I hope it's very cool wherever you are. So brain a bit frazzled today. Yeah, what did I have to unlearn? I think one of the things that I had to really unlearn is the first one was, am I good enough to be able to document and write and be a researcher, right? I mean, I often associate research with academics. So one thing was, am I enough? The second thing was, when I'm writing it or when I'm communicating to the people that I'm talking to, not speaking in that academic way, like really thinking about interviews, not as interviews, but as a talanoa, a conversation where each of us are learning from each other. So I think that was one of the things that I had to unlearn. I think the second one, which is, can I just say, it's a thought that's still in process, that I am. But it's sitting quite deeply in my chest, and I think I need to think more about it. But I want to say it up front, is that I think this idea about rhetoric, not rhetoric, the idea about rigor, right? This idea of rigor, when you talk about research, there's standards are always set from a Western academic perspective. And I think that we in the Pacific have a way of also expressing rigor that does not necessarily translate in the same way that Western academic styles see rigor. So for example, like people's lived experiences should be a benchmark for rigor. And I think that corroborating that with other people within the ecosystem should be another, it's also to Western forms of rigor, but it's not from a, I think communicating with others within a community that's not coming from a literature, journal kind of standard shouldn't be the only way we should see rigor. So I think that that's a concept that I think that those of us who work in the Pacific and want to be involved in research, we should really be interrogating what that means, what rigor means, and how do we express that and implement that from a specific experience.
Thanks, Viri. Ofa, I'd love to hear your reflections.
Malolele, everyone from Tonga, and just reflecting on the question and listening to what Virisila has shared. I think for me, I began my unlearning process of, your traditional way of undertaking research or consultancies many years ago, when I was in the hot seat myself, with an NGO in Tonga, having multiple consultants come in on a monthly basis. And I felt at one point that I was just being used as a person to extract information from. And it was kind of like the standard questions. And I remember making a remark to my staff and saying, can someone just come and film me while I answer these standard questions, and every time somebody comes in, just play it for them so that they can hear it, and I don't have to, go through all the etiquettes of welcoming people and sitting down and then answering the same lot of questions again. So I think my unlearning process came out of my frustration. I was like, what's going wrong here? What's, in terms of the normal processes of a consultancy or doing the groundwork or research, what needs to change? And I often found that in my conversations with my sisters across the Pacific, they were also feeling the same thing. It was a feeling of information being extracted all the time, and then just not, the follow-up or knowing where it actually went. Although people did say we're going to use it for what purposes, there was really no follow-up or no ownership of the information that we were giving people going out. So I think my unlearning process started there, and I really had to just, do a lot of reading on what a lot of Pacific Oceanic feminist researchers have said through their own work, that it's time to think audaciously, think outside the box, and look at other ways, other alternatives of collecting the stories of our women, and not making them feel like it's, it's putting them in a situation where they feel obliged to share the information, but they really don't want to share the information because it's done in such a way that there is no relationship nurtured. And so, yeah, I think that's where my unlearning started, and why I enjoyed this process with the other co-authors. Malo.
Thanks, Ofa. And the notion of fatigue, that definitely resonates. And also, Viri, what you raised in terms of am I enough, and looking at lived experiences as the benchmark for Riga as well. That's come through in both your experiences thus far. Nikki and Niketa, as co-writers and co-authors, what were some of the things you had to unlearn?
I'm happy to go first. So just first, thank you, Viri and Ofa, for your candor and honesty in that question. I really enjoyed listening to you. I think throughout my career, I'm constantly learning and unlearning and learning and unlearning. So it's a constant cycle. But having undertaken this effort with this remarkable group of women has left a particular impression on me. I've been trained, I think, just building off of what both Viri and Ofa have mentioned. My training was in Western academia. My research training was in Western academia, particularly in quantitative methods, where we had much of the purpose of the design in the information collection, as well as an analysis, was to diminish or to reduce the level of subjectivity. And I think through this process, it's been a really fantastic opportunity to lean into that subjectivity, to say that lived experience matters, and that we collectively need to embrace and empower that lived experience to surface and actually influence the direction of the research, both in terms of design as well as output. And so, that's been a real process for me, because there's this cognitive dissonance. There's this training that I've received that has said, do X, Y, Z to quash all of that. But but it's been very apparent through this experience how critical that has been to unearthing the nuanced findings, to make it valuable, not only for the donor, but more importantly for the community.
Thanks, Niketa. How about you, Nikki?
I resonate with a lot of what Niketa has just shared, but perhaps to get really specific about this particular experience, it was about unlearning my role in baselines and research. We work for a consultancy that undertakes, quite a number of baselines and research for DFAT, but actually the act of stepping out and back of a front seat role in the research, because we were not best placed to lead the consultations, to think about how those consultations should take place, with whom, in what way, over what period, asking which questions. They were not, that was not a role that I was equipped to play. And so there was a lot of unlearning from, again, you know, my background and the role as researcher, or holding that space, what it meant to actually step out and back and be led and see the value overwhelmingly and apparently in the output of that research process, but most importantly, the process of the research itself being so illuminating.
Thanks, Nikki and Niketa. As we're hearing from you both, stepping out and back is such an important part of unlearning, not only for leads, but for allies as well, and all those roles matter. To give you, our attendees, a sense of what our panelists have collaborated on together, you'll see here an overview of the chapters of the formative situational analysis on a slide. Ofa, Viri, Michelle, Niketa, and Nikki, each of them authored or co-authored these chapters, and there's 7 of them all together. And in that sense, with going further into our discussions on the piece of work, you can see here there's the first chapter, which is about the women and girls' voice, the second on the Pacific feminist movement. We also delve into sexual reproductive health and rights, women's economic empowerment, women's safety, Pacific ownership, as well as gender mainstreaming. Those are really meaty chapters to delve into. I've delved into them myself, and I encourage each and every one of you, if you haven't had a chance. Each chapter really stands on its own, and it features loudly and clearly the centeredness of Pacific women's voices, which was such a great thing to see. As always, we welcome any of your questions or reflections in the Q&A function, and we'll get further into it. So an important thread in the Synod, or the mangi-mangi, weaving these chapters together, is approaching gender equality priorities as an adaptive challenge. So looking at what practices are core and what are obstacles, testing new practices, and integrating new practices across organizations and systems. So for each of you, particularly, I was wondering if Viri and Nikki, you could get us started applying the adaptive lens to the current state of Pacific research on gender equality. What are the enabling and hindering practices at play? What do you think are some of the new research practices we could be testing? And how might these be better integrated by donors and researchers?
Maybe I'll start, and Nikki, maybe we can just riff off each other. Like, I'll just put some ideas. I think one of the things that I would like more research to lean into is to really see how we can capture information in people's actual mother tongue, you know, because English is a language that is not expansive enough. And there's certain words in English that there is no word in it in our, in our own mother tongue, like, for example, gender equality. And a lot of the feminists and women's rights activists that we work with, that was one of the things that they really struggled with, was trying to explain what gender equality means in their language, and them also saying that gender is not the only identifier in a human being in their community, that there are other ways of identifying. And it was a really interesting thing that was pointed out to me by Itauke person to try and explain this point to me, because I was not really getting it, considering that I am Indigenous Fijian. And she was saying to me, you know, when you think about it and you go into the community and you introduce yourself, you never actually say your name. You first start saying where your village is, your tikina, da, then you say your name, right? And then the fact that you're a woman is like somewhere back there. And I think that that's really representative of how languages are so rich and different, and how when you're and how when you're not speaking, you're not able to capture people's knowledge and experiences in their language, there's so much knowledge and wisdom that is lost in there, right? And so you end up having the interpreted short version, which doesn't really capture what you really want, the depth of what people are trying to say. So one is leaning into, leaning into the discomfort of having people speak in their own language, and the researcher or the researcher body take on the responsibility and the burden of translating that, right? Rather than letting the person that you are in dialogue with take on that responsibility, because I think it's a lot of burden to carry. And I find people actually, what's the word? Censor themselves. They censor themselves because they don't want to use the wrong English word. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing too is other words like, for example, decolonization. This was another interesting thing, right? Like one of the academics who's also from this region, when we're talking about decolonization, said, decolonize from what? Like from white-centered Western ideas to Fijian-centered ideas. And I was like thinking, I was like, oh my God, you're right. Fijians also, there's a hegemony in this region where the Fijians are dominant. But again, I learned so much. And I think that these ideas which push us out of our comfort zones. So for those of us who commission research, let's lean into that. If you want to get the best information, I think lean into the discomfort, lean into where people are at and where they're comfortable at, because that is where the magic will happen. Yeah, I'll stand there. Nikki, over to you.
Oh, very, insightful threads there, Viri, and I agree that particularly where donors are situated in countries that lean towards these academic Western conceptions of credibility, as we were talking about earlier, expanding that notion of what counts as credible evidence, like actually asking credible for whom, valid to whom, rigorous as defined by whom, allows us to, as was demonstrated through the feminist movement chapter of this analysis, surface more timely, more relevant, more nuanced, and more informative understanding than we would through peer-reviewed academic articles. If you actually look at the number of peer-reviewed academic articles cited in that chapter, it's quite a very, very few. And the richness of the analysis comes from the conversations Viri and Michelle undertook, and the sense-making, the collective sense-making that was undertaken by Pacific women to think through the implications of those conversations and what that meant in thinking about the size, connectivity, depth of the feminist movement or movements in the Pacific. So I think it's a real challenge for donors thinking about what constitutes credible evidence and what they're missing out on by having such narrow conceptions of what constitutes credible evidence. I think that came out quite strongly. And the other point I was considering was when we're thinking about the enabling factors, what actually worked in this context to what stars aligned to allow this work to be undertaken. We heard from Joe earlier that the DFAT team were experienced in advocating for inclusive processes, and they had a real commitment to bridging the gap between DFAT policy and rhetoric to implementation. The DT Global team itself were really strong advocates for an inclusive approach, and had a really conscious effort, I think, to shift the status quo, that they knew that a traditional baseline wasn't going to actually elicit meaningful information. And I think the biggest part of that, and I'd be interested, Viri, to hear your reflections again, but a critical component for this research is the fact that Viri and Ofa and Michelle agreed to participate knowing that it was their expertise, but also their social positioning that allowed these conversations to take place in the way in which they did. We wouldn't have had the richness and the insights without their participation. And I guess I'm curious what the enabling factor or what drew you or to participating in the research in this way as authors, Viri.
Yeah, Mary, if it's okay, I was just thinking about that too, Nikki. Thank you for prompting me. Yeah, our positionality and the credibility that we have within movements, and because we're part of the movements, I think you're right. I think it did play a huge part in opening up doors and people being available to speaking to us, because it was us. Because I think if it was anybody else, they would do what I would have done if I was in that person. I would have just dodged them and called up Joanne and go, why does this person want to talk to me? I don't want to talk to them. Really, I would have said that. So yes, I do think that that is a really important factor. I think the other important factor as well was the fact that, again, the enabling services team is led by Joanne, who is someone that Michelle, and I know Ofa, we've trusted because we've worked with Joanne for so many years, including with Emily. So we've had these deep relationships, and it was really, we're leveraging those relationships and together collectively saying that we only want to be involved in this if you're actually going to take what we say to you seriously, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because otherwise our credibility as as people part of this movement is also under threat. So we have to think about this as a way that we all need to be caring about each other and the way that we work, because that's how we're going to come up with something rich. So yeah, I leaned into it because of the people involved, the amount of flexibility that I was given, and also the room to be able to influence what the final outcome would look like. So those three things were really things that that really played a role in me participating. And also people saying to me, you got to make sure that what I'm saying is reflected in this research, which is something that Michelle and I were really, really made a point of ensuring that happened.
If I could ask one follow-up, because I'm curious. Viri, you talked about being able to actually shape the research itself, and I think that comes through in terms of credibility quite strongly in previous comments that we've heard today. In what ways do you find what has been produced is of value to the spaces in which you work, or when you imagined and you set off on the process and you had ideas about how you wanted to shape the research or think about its value for the spaces in which you work, has that eventuated, or can you see that eventuating? I'm curious if that thread's continued for you.
No, absolutely. I think that the final document is exactly like the way that Mary described it, right? It captures a particular time in history. And I think that that is reflective of what was said, what was felt, what was heard in that moment. And also because there is how do you say, there wasn't a lot of actually the majority of some of the difficult things that we were trying to express came through. Like it is reflected in the report, right? And I remember one particular one was around DFAT, and we talked about it at great length in the sense-making meeting, individually, and to be honest, I really did think it wouldn't appear, but I did see it there. So, and I think, again, to me, some of the characters that you identified earlier of people who are in the background playing this role of creating that enabling environment to ensure that this product was delivered. I think that, there were key people at DTI as well as DFAT who had huge influence to kind of explain the context of where that comment or where that particular finding was coming from, and how how it should be seen as something that you can work from.
Thanks, Viri and Nikki. Ofa, I know you'll have a chance to weigh in, particularly in our next chapter. But Nikki, did you want to say something? I saw you unmute yourself there.
Just to say thanks, Viri.
All right. So like Viri mentioned, this is certainly something I can relate to, having just come back from a couple of weeks of community consultations, speaking my native language. It's a tremendous responsibility. Language is so central to our worldview, and it's a worthwhile responsibility because it centers our collaborators, our partners, and the way they see the world, and it opens the door for their whole identity and not just parts of it. And I think, like Viri and Nikki, you both mentioned, you also recognize that you bring your own positionality and your own accountabilities and relationships into this space. I love the question you asked, Viri, about decolonization from what to where. Such a great question, but also recognizing the intra-regional hegemony as well, which is so key. If women are diverse, so is our region. It's more than just one or a few countries, and aligning the stars to connect the rhetoric to the implementation. We all know it's been hard, but we know that business as usual doesn't work. And as you said, it took a lot of actors to hold the line together. As a reader, I encourage fellow webinar attendees to dive into these chapters. As I said, I was struck by the freshness of the process. Broadly speaking, it's a two-pronged methodology of document review and stakeholder consultations. And there was also the Tala Noa methodology, informal conversations held over a series of 8 regional meetings. And then there were 2 rounds of collective sense-making workshops that Viri referred to. Starting with Ofa, your chapters use the Tala Noa methodology. Can you share, Ofa, how the process and methodologies such as Tala Noa informed this work? And how do you feel it contributes to redefining and reimagining Pacific research on gender equality?
Malo mere, and also big malo apito to Viri and Nikki for the conversations, which has sparked a lot of ways of thinking, moving forward in terms of when we're talking about researchers, particularly from the Pacific in this space. So I just wanted to state at the outset that the difference between the Tala Noa methodology, which I know a lot of researchers have used, and the Tala Noa methodology is that the latter is more audacious, particularly when viewed through a feminist and decolonized lens, as we heard from Viri. Tala Noa was a methodology that I had used in the past. It's a Pacific-based methodology, often carries inherent power dynamics. And I bring in here Dr. Linda Smith, who says that research in Indigenous spaces must acknowledge the ways in which knowledge has been historically produced, packaged, and consumed. So Tala Noa may, or it can, perpetuate the Tala Noa methodology, or it can perpetuate these traditional hierarchies and gender biases, particularly by centering the voices of men and those in positions of power, thus leaving women, especially those in human rights and gender equality work, out of the Tala Noa space. So using Tala Noa for me, it emerges as a feminist intervention, disrupting these power structures and prioritizing the voices of women. And I use the phrase audacity as coined by a good friend of most of ours on this panel, Dr. Yvonne Underhill-Sen, where she uses the phrase audacity of the ocean to reconcile the tensions of the unequal power struggles present in a Tala Noa. So as a researcher, I used the Tala Noa to provide me some trajectories in moving out of the Tala Noa methodology and moving forward. So it helped me to understand the entrenched systems of the Tala Noa system, where men usually take the space, particularly those with decision-making powers. And I wanted to advocate for a space where Pacific women's experiences were shared and documented in their full complexity. So, for example, for this paper, whether it be Talatala Noa as a Pacific woman, as Pacific women gathering over those 8 to 9 regional spaces, or whether they were huddled up in a hotel room in the evening, talking about different gender equality issues, or whether it was between one-to-one conversation or talatala noa between myself and another Pacific woman who's working in the movement across the Pacific. So in this way, talatala noa redefines the research process by actively breaking down the conventional hierarchies that often discomfort, distort, or diminish women's voices, creating a space for women's stories to be heard and valued on their own terms. Bringing in as well Dr. Teresia Te Aiwa. We all follow her work to this day. She also emphasized the importance of creating Indigenous research spaces that are not merely academic, but also engage with the everyday experiences, struggles, and aspirations of Pacific peoples, and in this case, Pacific women. Talatala Noa is rooted in this commitment to make research accessible and meaningful to the communities it serves, especially those most often excluded from the research process. Another concept that I used that I didn't really explain in the paper that I wrote, but I want to share here on this webinar after reflecting as we were preparing for this webinar. Another concept that aided my use of the talatala noa is this Tongan concept of manatu ki api, which literally means remember home, where you have the opportunity to leave home, gain different experiences, gain different knowledge elsewhere, and I expected to remember home and return to help. So I guess that was my positionality in this research, combining the talatala noa and the manatu ki api. It adds an important dimension to talatala noa because as a researcher, manatu ki api reinforced me in my to never forget my ethical responsibility to the women of the Pacific who work in this space, to be in constant dialogue with them, the community of women who were willing to share their stories with me, acknowledge their vulnerabilities, her stories, their lived experiences, and how was I going to take that forward? It was very important that they understood that process and to hold me accountable as a researcher. So my role in the manatu ki api always reminds me of my positionality. This research process is not about extraction, what I spoke about earlier in terms of what sparked me to do research differently. It's about giving back and ensuring that the knowledge shared with me remains true to the origins. As Dr. Yvonne Underhill-Sem says, this process requires us to engage with audacity and integrity, challenging and reshaping the boundaries of research to honor the voices of those that are often excluded or unheard in the academic process. So talatala noa for me is a decolonized approach. It's a feminist approach to research that actively resists patriarchal and hierarchical structures. So just to end that off, I think if we think of it in terms of waters, Talanoa is like a river, the methodology. It follows a set path shaped by the landscape around it. Conversations flows within the boundaries of tradition, where certain voices, often those in power, shape the current. Just as a river moves predictably in its banks, Talanoa operates within the existing power structures. Talanoa, on the other hand, is like an ocean voyage. It does not follow a fixed path, but it's guided by the stars, the wind, and the wisdom of the navigator. Instead of being confined by the banks of tradition, talatala noa allows for movement in multiple directions, adapting to the voices and experiences of those who are part of it. The canoe is not steered by a single authority, but by collective knowledge. In manatu ki api, the practice of wayfinding, it reminds the voyagers that they are not simply traveling for the sake of discovery, but to return home with knowledge that will strengthen their people. Malo.
Ofa, thank you so much for that. Niketa, I remember you talking earlier on about how it is so easy to forget the different frameworks that we can be steeped in through education, through the ways in which we are trained to work, all the learning that happens. Would love to hear from you, reflecting on how these methodologies that are grounded in the Pacific worldview, and how they can expand the space in terms of research.
Sure, thanks, and thank you, Ofa. I was just reflecting that the learning and unlearning is continuing as we speak, so I really appreciate that, and I love the idea of having the audacity to honor the voices, and I think that comes down to the heart, perhaps, Mary, of your question, which is, around this idea of rigorous methodology. And it comes, and I was thinking hard about this last night, and the idea of rigor and the idea of having standards and methodology, I think, is rooted in this, in a notion of distrust, that we need to build in measures to ensure that the information that we're receiving is accurate, is credible, is not accurate and credible and worthy. Worthy of being absorbed by whom, and it's oftentimes seen as absorbed by Western audiences, and the idea that we're flipping the script a little bit, and we're saying that this information, that the situational analyses, yes, they were a donor deliverable, but very much so we had the community in mind when developing it. We had developed it for to honor the voices of those that we're trying to help, to try and capture the voices of the fantastic advocates and leaders and actors across the Pacific who are doing the hard work to get it to achieve the impact that we want to see. And who are honestly time poor. And so by engaging them in an extractive process to teach us, to tell us what to give us information that honestly may lead to some aha moments for us, but is very much just kind of commonplace understanding by many of them, feels both inefficient and ineffective. And so we're not, by focusing our energies on having conversations that we hope are mutually beneficial, by producing a report that we hope will be used as tools for the community to take forward and to capture actually what it is that is important to them, I hope is leading to the reimagination of Pacific research. I just think that the only other thing that I wanted to ask or to add to the conversation, and Ofa, I wanted to turn it back to you. I found the sense making of the workshops extremely valuable, and so just for the purposes of just to provide a little bit more information, we as co-authors engaged in a number of Talanoa and Talanoa exercises. We had lots of conversations with actors across the Pacific. We gathered that information, and we as co-authors, as well as along with colleagues at Enabling Services and at DFAT, had a conversation to make sure where we ask the question, are we getting it right? Is our understanding of what we're hearing correct? What are we missing? And then we had that same conversation with a larger group of actors at the Pacific Women Lead Reflections Workshop. It was taking. And we had to go back to the writing. We had to go back to the drawing board and rewrite much of what we thought we were going to take forward. But I think that in itself led to, again, a product that we hope will be useful for a wider audience. But I wanted to ask Ofa what she thought, and maybe Viri as well, what you thought of that process. I know that I found it valuable because I needed I need your help to make sense of everything. But just in terms of the value of your time, how did you find all of that?
Yeah, interesting question, Niketa. I had a few wake-up call moments during the Making Sense workshops. And I think it came from recognizing the gap between rhetoric and real systemic change. Often we leave the narrative to those who, how can I say this? Women like Viri and myself, who a lot of our Pacific sisters in the Pacific look to speak or give authority to us to speak on gender and women's human rights issues in the Pacific. And this wake-up call for me was, it can perpetuate hierarchical and colonial practices. So it pushed me to advocate for, for the using the Stala Tala Noa, talking to women who would otherwise not be given authority by the bigger group to speak on their behalf. And having a chat with them one-on-one, a Tala Tala Noa on the side, whether it be during afternoon tea or after the workshop or in my hotel room, where I would find a whole lot of other information that was critical for the paper. But because they were in the big space, like I was saying, it was a wake-up call for me, because I recognized that there were some who were given the authority to speak and others who held back because of that. And how can you use your feminist and Pacific approaches in understanding these nuances to get their stories, or to say to them, hey, your view is important as well. Why don't we have a chat? And then finding something else that had not come from those who often spoke in the space. Yeah, I think hopefully I'm making sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I found the sense making the sense making space really useful, because I think also another thing too that we did, that the way that this research was designed, and was that, again, we went into these silos, right? Like women in leadership, blah, 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 without, but we know in reality that for women in this area, they're working across all those themes, and they don't actually see it in the different silos. So like for them, those silos just represents money flowing to them, but not necessarily the way it is experienced, in the work, right? So when we were having those conversations, some of the things that we were seeing, or we were sharing from like the feminist movements conversations, it was reiterated, or it was being corroborated by information that Ofa was seeing, say, for example, in the leadership, like the understanding of leadership, like the way the program understood it was roles of authority, and that was what was being funded. But the way that conversations were coming up and people understood leadership was actually the act of being in leadership, right? Like the act of leadership. And that was also reflected in the feminist movements conversations. So when we were sense making, we were able to see the interconnectedness of these issues, and how some issues kind of compounded a problem, or had the opportunity to be able to open up and unpack some things that are, kind of locked up in a silo. So that sense making space, I think, is a really critical, place for sharing information, and to be able to get clarity. And when you think about practices, like for example, there's a Fijian practice called Sole Vaki, right? It's the practice where a group of people or a group of villagers or family will go and help another community, another family, say for example, to build a house, right? And what you find is in the building of the house is you're helping each other build that house, but there's also that space where people are exchanging information, exchanging stories, where they are making sense of things that if they hadn't actually come and worked together or shared a meal or built this house together, they would have only understood it from like one part of the, one part of the story. And so again, I think the point I'm trying to make is that in Indigenous practices of community, of being with each other, there's always space for sense making. And those spaces are, like there's one of the questions that Mary was asking about, like, what are some research practices that comes from Indigenous practices? And I always have to struggle with this because for a lot of time, I don't think about it as a practice because I'm just doing it. Like it's part of your identity, right? And sometimes the practice of actually sitting with it and trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? Like if I was to make this into research practice, like write down all the steps. On one level, I think it's important because you are visibilizing the learning, a process of how learning is done, but also maybe in some Indigenous communities, and I can't speak for all Indigenous communities, there's some knowledge only some people should know. And I think that when you're talking about research, this is also a critical element that not all knowledge needs to be shared, and that some knowledge is sacred and needs to be, yeah, I know I've just jumped for a couple of points, but those are some of the ideas in my head.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And this idea as well that these processes are not necessarily linear, right? And perhaps this is coming back to where I started as trained in academia, and this need to kind of consolidate and to simplify so that there's a story along a linear path that leads to something, and then to from a baseline to an end line, and then we see a natural growth between the two. That is the hope. But this idea of coming together and understanding that these change processes are happening all over the place and are interconnected was definitely something that I took away as well. Thank you.
Thanks all. And Niketa, you've steered us into our final question before we navigate through some of the questions from our attendees. Talking about credibility and advocating for this broader, more inclusive sense of what is credible. This analysis has an important purpose and an afterlife. It'll be used as a benchmark for Pacific Women's Lead's work in progressing its priorities. Now, you've all outlined, why oftentimes that's a tremendous challenge. The status quo, there's a long way to go when it comes to decolonizing how we recognize and how we value knowledge. For me, as a Pacific Indigenous woman reading this analysis, having worked in DFAT with DFAT-funded programs, I've seen how the sausage gets made. And, like you said, Ofa, in all those walks, remembering your responsibility to your community. For me, it's the iterative, not necessarily linear, like you said, Niketa, aspects. The conversation-based inclusive nature of this methodology is precisely what makes it credible to me, and I'm sure many Pacific women and actors who read this. But for each of you as co-authors, having been part of this process, how can donors in the gender equality space expand their view of what is regarded as credible research? Maybe Viri and Ofa, could you kick us off?
Ofa, how about you start? I feel like I've been talking forever.
Maybe share the lifting, Ofa. Or maybe we'll give Ofa some time to think. Yes, we can hear you, Ofa.
Oh, okay. Sorry, but the internet's not that great, so I'm leaving the camera off, but I can turn it on just in case. Or well, probably leave it off. Yeah. Just to answer your question, what can donors do? I think is to use the methodology that I used. Tala no with us Pacific researchers. I don't think that you know, what Niketa said earlier, or was it Nikki, who said that they've followed Western methodologies for such a long time. We came through that as well. I mean, I spent almost 8 years at universities following the same Western methodologies, and it took me a long time to unlearn and really ground myself in decolonizing all these approaches that I had been taught for so many years. I honestly feel that Tala Tala Noa is deeply rooted in indigeneity and epistemology. It affirms the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems, and it really irks me. I'm sorry, when we talk about credibility and saying it's like almost questioning that, it really pushes me to the edge, because I feel that almost the Western ways of doing research all these years has resulted in us questioning Indigenous knowledge, and that's what really upsets me. And I hope that if donors can do anything to unlearn and Tala Tala Noa with our specific researchers to understand why we're using Indigenous knowledge to shape research processes. It's rooted in the lived experiences, languages, like Viri was saying, and cultural practices of the Pacific peoples. I mean, if you bring the question around credibility into what I've just said, and you heard Viri say that respondents will often refrain from saying something because they can't think of the right word at the time to express it in the English language. How credible is that? You know, who asks what is credible? Who has that authority to ask what is credible? Tala Tala Noa challenges colonial and hegemonic frameworks of knowledge. It positions indigenous ways of knowing, shaped by communal relationships that we all live and breathe every day, and our connections. I think that's all I wanted to say for now. Thank you.
Yeah, Mary, maybe I'll jump in. You know, in my day job, I'm actually a donor too. I'm a funder. And one of the things that we do as a funder as a feminist funder is we resource needs that comes from communities, like agendas that are set by communities, not us as the donor, right? We don't know what the problem is and we don't have the solution. So when it comes to research, I think that's also the premise that we come from as well, is the fund the research, the knowledge that people want to share with their communities, with groups of people of influence, fund that kind of research. That's the kind of research that we like to fund it in the language that they wanted, you know, the research to be produced in. And also this idea that not all knowledge is in the written form. Like some of us come from communities and from, communities and countries where the language is not a written, like the way that we communicate and share knowledge is not just written. It's oral, it's through dance, it's through carvings, it's through, it's different kinds of, it's in different ways that it's being shared. And I think that sometimes as donors, we just get fixated on the written word, that we forget about all these other kinds of knowledge, the way that knowledge is shared. Like I said, in our region, it's in dance, it's in the way a tapa is printed, or it's the way that a mat is weaved. Or if all of those things tell a story and represents a particular history of that moment. And I think as should be funding, the ways that want to communicate and not just always focus on the written word. The written word, I think, is important, like for us as funders, when we're talking back to funders or when we're talking back to people who are going to give us money, then writing it in the written word is useful. But for other people, like, I think we should always leave that to the communities that we work with and be led by them rather than by our own needs to amplify our relevance.
Thanks, Viri and Ofa. I think that steers us so very well into our first question from our attendees. And Niketa and Nikki, I know we've had conversations as well about how Pacific adjacent, or even non-Pacific collaborators or conspirators can play a role in furthering these efforts as well that Ofa and Viri are talking about. But our first question from one of our attendees is, to the panel, could you share with us one result or finding that you felt would not have come out without your local ways of doing research? I'm curious to hear what stood out for you, was surprising, and revealed a new angle or perspective that the conventional research ways may not have captured. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'd love to share. I had the privilege of supporting with the writing on the movement, the Pacific feminist movement chapter, and I was really what drew my attention was this insight around the unintended consequences of donor-funded coalitions of organizations. So by that, it was meant that you have a donor that is funding, say, 4 or 5 different civil society organizations around a particular issue, and bringing those organizations together to strategize, reflect, connect, align efforts. And there's really positive outcomes that can come from that coalition. But that there are also really unintended harmful consequences of those coalitions that are built around a donor's funding that are connected upward to a donor rather than outward to community and to other organizations that fall outside that funder's pool of organizations. And so the disruption that causes to what might otherwise be organic connections and movement building between civil society organizations working on a particular issue, because necessarily there'll be organizations excluded from those convening spaces. So it really highlighted, I guess, even when there are real strengths coming from, donor practices that are celebrated, there are also what we don't grapple with enough is these really unintended harmful consequences that have implications, particularly when donor funding is removed. And I think that's always, in my mind, is what practices, systems, coalitions are created based around donor funding that aren't considering what it means in the long term. We're sort of thinking in 3 and 5 and, year cycles. So that certainly wasn't anywhere else, but in the conversations that insight came out.
Maybe I can just build off of that, Nikki. Thank you. Which is this, I think this idea of surfacing unintended consequences or impacts that are perhaps outside the theory of change. Traditional research has us very much focused, we're focusing our questions and our research design around understanding whether the hypothetical or the suggested likely outcomes and impacts that have been stated in a theory of change are happening or not. We're not necessarily encouraged, or we don't have the resources to go beyond that and say what else is happening as a result of the interventions. And so, a number of unintended consequences surfaced because of this exercise. The idea that women's economic empowerment has very strong linkages to, or we have to consider the possibility of the correlation between women's quote unquote economic advancement, increased income, and gender-based violence within the home. So we can't just look to increase income. We also have to provide support services to women who are now perhaps earning more than their male counterparts, their partners at home, and what the impacts of that are. That certainly would not have surfaced, or perhaps would not have been emphasized as much if we had not had these more open-ended conversations. Much of the literature, again, in related to women's economic empowerment, suggests that the path forward is related to formalizing the informal markets, the quote unquote, I'll say informal in parentheticals, but there's perhaps a de-emphasized consideration of the value of that flexibility for women who are partaking, who are having to face that double burden of working at home as well as earning money outside. And so what does that mean? We need to then focus more on providing protections rather than formalization. So again, it's that emphasis of what actually matters within the Pacific context. Once we broadened out our questioning, that was surfaced for me.
Mary, if I can jump in here, reflecting on that question that was given, I think to explain what is the difference. So what you're talking about, these specific approaches that you're trying to use, what difference does it make? I think in terms of putting together, an example I can give is putting together the paper on women's voice, and just reflecting on the outcomes for this particular area. More women and girls in all their diversity are respected, listened to, and influence decision-making at all levels and spheres: community, provincial, national, public, and private. That's the kind of outcome. And then there were indicators, right? So for the traditional approach to this is that you would design your key questions based on the indicators so that you know whether there's progress or not. But in terms of having a positionality within the women's rights space and the gender equality space in the Pacific, I've heard stories before that go beyond the indicators, that have talked about women who have so much informal authority that they are able to mobilize communities or factions in their communities towards change or towards something that's positive to better the lives of everybody in the community. This would not come out from, let's say, a foreign consultant coming in to undertake this, who would just stick to the indicators, and then whatever responses they got from that would frame the paper. I think because of my positionality, my indigeneity in terms of the women's space, and understanding the stories that have already been shared, I could facilitate and navigate a discussion that would bring other stories out, other ways of understanding women's voice that's not just is what is written on paper. So the power of women's informal authority in different spaces across the Pacific, which is hardly ever gets any time on media platforms, nobody knows about it. And so the age-old story of the Pacific is doing very badly in terms of women's leadership, because we always default back to the indicator of how many women in parliament or how many women sitting on statutory boards, and not looking at using an adaptive framework to flip the story and say, actually, look at what all these powerful women have been able to mobilize, and then changing the thinking and the attitude of readers of that story, of listeners to that story, which will then push the boundaries and understand women's leadership in another framing. I guess that's what I could add to this question. Malo.
Thanks all. Our next question is to you, the co-author team as well. How did the team accomplish getting the methodology for this report to be locally led? It's a great achievement. And do you have any tips for practitioners looking to do the same?
How did we get the research to be locally led? Well, it helps that the Pacific Women Lead Enabling Services has a local that's leading it, and therefore practicing and living the localization strategy. So I definitely think that between Joanne, her team of experts here within her unit, with the support of people at DFAT and their allies at DT Global, I think that all of that working together really, really led to this research being led by locals. And I think it was also the fact that, and this probably sounds big-headed, but I think they did it on purpose. Like they chose us specifically to do this research, right? Like they worked around our time. And I am again just acknowledging our positionality, and they wanted to leverage that. And I think that because both Michelle and I and Ofa are also at this point in our work where we want to see transformative change, and we want it to happen like yesterday. So it was really important for us to, to kind of have conversations with Joanne and her team and figure out a way that we could co-create this research together, and that where all our experiences could leverage and to benefit gender equality right across the region.
And I might just add to that in a very practical sense, DFAT has policies and principles in place that support the idea of locally led localization, yielding power. They have this language in their documents, in their policies, in the rhetoric. I think what happens is that program managers or investment managers who are needing to deliver on a baseline or a particular piece of research, they face a roadblock in justifying a departure from the norm. And so part of our work to find the in was to use DFAT's policies and language and rhetoric to justify, and that felt icky. I really have to be so straight up and echo what Ofa and Viri and Niketa have already spoken about. It felt really icky to have to justify why on a program dedicated to Pacific women and girls in all their diversity, we would have to justify why centering the voices of Pacific women and girls and Pacific authors is the appropriate approach. So that felt really icky, but it was a necessary inroad to support this come to fruition, with all the other elements that we've talked about previously. Of course, that we have an incredibly supportive DFAT team who were receptive and wanting to advocate with that language. We had DT Global being incredibly principled in their approach and advocacy. And of course, then we have Viri and Ofa and Michelle who decide, that they would like to come on board and participate and see value in this process. But part of it was really working within an established system and using that language to say, you've got all the principles in place, this is just how you enact them. And that's how we close the gap between what you're stating and how you're operating.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Nikki, and yeah, I completely agree that there were aspects of it that felt icky, but necessary as we're on a path, we're on a positive path forward, but there's still work to be done to gain acceptance, and perhaps we moved away from using buzzwords that may put people on the offensive. So, rather than decolonization, letting local actors, local leaders identify issues and solutions, which makes sense. Letting local actors and leaders lead us on a path of understanding what matters. And I think, if I can also just add that, as Nikki mentioned, just using DFAT material, there's a wonderful paper written by ACFID on wielding and yielding power. I remember drawing upon that in one of our conversations, saying that this is all stuff that you're talking about. And so as allies, Nikki and I had the ability to draw on some of that knowledge and be able to bridge that gap, as she said. But being very almost strategic for understanding that hopefully that it's a necessary step forward.
Mary, can I just also add something else that, as feminists working in feminist organizations, one of the most underrated power that I think, and that was also at play here with us to do this work, is this idea of feminist friendship as a strategy, where we're leveraged and as a power. It's also because Michelle, Joanne, Ofa, me, like we've known for a very long time, built this trust with each other over a very, very long time. We can be very frank with each other and know that we are not going to take it personally because we all know that it's coming from a good intention. Friendship, feminist friendship as a strategy is like something that people don't really value, but I'm telling you, this is how feminist movements make magic happen. It really needs to become like a official strategy of working, because that's what people do and we just don't name it.
Thanks, Viri. And leveraging feminist friendship as a strategy was certainly something that that got me involved in this conversation, and I'm glad to reaffirm existing friendships and expand the circle as well. So there you go. For our other question, how do you navigate personal challenges when encountering perspectives on gender and sexuality in your research that differ from your own? Does this affect data collection and analysis? It was great to hear about icky but necessary practices, and maybe some of that ickiness goes into our internal reflections or reactions as well when we encounter perspectives that that differ from our own. Please, Ofa.
Well, for me, the first thing that I have to tell myself is like, maintain the face. Because everything that I think is reflected on my face, like my face has subtitles that I need to learn to kind of calm it down. But I'm very frank about it. Like I'm very frank, like, yes, I don't have that, perspective. It's very interesting. I'd like to know more. So yes, I will, as uncomfortable as it is for me, I think that part of that conversation was just trying to hear where people were coming from, and really kind of turning low that voice in your head. And just being present in that moment and just listening to what is being said. And you may not understand it in that moment, but just listening, capturing that information and engaging in that conversation, because you don't want to, I never wanted to unintentionally like write someone off. I wanted them to trust me that I was hearing them for what they had to say, and I was going to document it irrespective of how I personally felt about it. And because, like I said before, like my face has subtitles, I always said it up front. Yes, I don't agree with this, but I'm here to listen to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Viri. I know we're pressed for time, but I'll head into the Another question, and if you have other reflections, you can always chime in. Were there any chapters that as authors you felt were difficult to navigate or put together that represent the collective realities of the Pacific? Noting that while we share common challenges, our diversity makes for understanding complexities also important. I think something that the analysis definitely states outright that I was grateful for is about acknowledging the diversities within the region as well, and the various hegemonies, for instance, that Viri referred to. And we have this is our final question in terms of from an attendee. Were there any chapters in particular where you found it difficult to navigate that cohesiveness, but also incredible diversity in the region?
Yeah, I think
I think the feminist.
Sorry.
Oh, go, Niketa. Please go.
Go ahead, Ofa, please. Okay, I'll just I was just going to say that writing all the chapters was difficult for that exact reason. Being able to we were bound by a bit of a page limit. Obviously, we didn't want to we could have written theses on each one of these topics. And so we did have to condense and prioritize just to some extent, and being able to do that in a very balanced way across all chapters, whether it be sexual and reproductive health rights, women's economic empowerment, the feminist movement, etc. Being able to bring in all those diverse voices, and in particular do justice to the voices of persons with disabilities, with women with disabilities, seeking that we didn't understand. We pulled in other consultants and advocates working specifically in that space to make sure that we had it right. So maybe the response to that is that that's a really good question, and it made it difficult to navigate across all the chapters. And the way that we helped mitigate that issue was to actually bring in more informants where we felt our perspectives were lacking.
Yeah, I think it's sorry. Yeah, I think just to quickly add, I think it was the chapter on Pacific ownership. There was kind of a back and forth in terms of the understanding of a lot of the actors in the women's space, women who are working on gender equality and women's rights and women's voice, women's safety. There was kind of a confusion as to what was meant by Pacific ownership. And although there was an outcome and there were indicators, but the discussion was kind of open. And I as a facilitator and navigator, I welcomed the discussion being open, because then we found out that the two key agencies who are supposed to take ownership of gender equality in the Pacific, namely PIFS and SPC, were seen amongst other players. So seen amongst the UN agencies, UNDP or UN Women, WHO, or other players such as MFAT, DFAT. And so that was really interesting. And I think what it is reflective of is that there needs to be more taratara noa across the Pacific region in all spaces around about Pacific ownership, and who are our, I don't want to say agencies or crop agencies, but who are the two bodies that are supposed to be ensuring that they take ownership of these commitments, which, after writing the chapter, was the irony in all of what I've just said, is that when the Pacific leaders forum happened in Tonga last year, there was no reference to gender equality. So yeah, that's probably something I wanted to share in terms of writing the chapter, getting people's perspectives around it, understanding, you know, some of the questions and confusion around Pacific ownership, and then actually seeing it play out in terms of the Pacific Leaders Forum last year in their meeting, in the outcomes document. So a lot more taratara noa needs to take place. Courageous conversations, yeah.
Thanks, Ofa. Courageous and audacious taratara noas need to happen, and we're so glad that this is one of them. 90 minutes have just flown by, and that's credit to our panelists, but also to our wonderful attendees for your really, really rich questions. So I just want to thank our panelists today, Niketa, Nikki, Virisila, and Ofa, for Joanne for steering us at the outset as well. Thank you for bringing these chapters to light in the hope that Pacific women's perspectives and voices can be centered in steering Pacific Women Leads efforts, as they should be. And so thank you to our attendees for your engagement today. For those of you whose questions we could not get to, we will answer and send them around to registered attendees after this webinar. So as we mentioned, this is the first in a quarterly series. Please stay tuned to the Pacific Women Lead website at pacificwomen.org for future webinars. A recording of this webinar will be there as well, and you can subscribe to updates via the website and keep posted on the next conversation. Until then, wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the week. Winaka, malo, and komotata. Thanks, everyone.
Nakamere mode.